The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian terrorist set off a chain reaction among the nations of Europe, leading to war in August of 1914. The Americans watched as British and French forces unexpectedly held the line against Germany. On April 6, 1917, after nearly 3 years of sitting on the sidelines, the United States declared war on Germany and in doing so joined the Great War. In the United States, being able to fight in the military, being able to vote, and being a citizen were all linked together. Women did not earn their right to vote because they did not fight. It would be America's experiences during the Great War overseas that would start to change women's status at home. General John Pershing was put in charge of the American Expeditionary Force. He knew communications had to be in place before the first units could go into battle. Soldiers needed to know what to do and where to go once they were at the front. The Signal Corps was a branch of the Army in charge of sending messages. Telephones were now how commanders communicated with the front, and this was one area where Americans had superiority. In France, the Americans struggled with the French telephone systems. The lines were damaged. It could take hours for French operators to make connections, and they hung up on calls if they felt insulted. Captain Robert Owen suggested recruiting American bilingual female telephone operators in the fall of 1917. At this time, telephones had no dials. A customer picked up the phone and told the operator what they needed. The phone companies tried to use male telegraph messengers as the new operators, but they were too rambunctious and upset customers. Soon 80 to 85% of all American operators were women. The job of the telephone operator became one of the few options open to educated women. All jobs weren't open to all people in the America of 1917. Your social class and education, skin color, religion, gender, and even your accent decided what career options were open to you. But in America, the workforce was changing. By 1910, 1/5 of the American labor force was women. An emergency appeal was published in newspapers around the country. First Lieutenant Ernest Wesson organized the female telephone operator units, and his initial press release said that the women would serve in the Army. Candidates had to pass French language, medical, psychological, and background tests before being sent to AT&T training school. Out of approximately 7,000 applicants, 450 women met all the requirements and 223 were sent overseas. The chosen women were women who had education but valued adventure. They were expected to behave like ladies, but were being sent to war zone. They needed to work the switchboards as a team, but also needed to be able to make decisions independently. But for all these women, they felt the call of duty. The first unit was put under the command of Chief Operator Grace Banker, who had studied French at Barnard College. When the call came for female telephone operators, she was working as an instructor at the New York Telephone Company. Banker was exactly what the Army was looking for in a chief operator.
People like Grace Banker, I think, found out what kind of leadership she had, because she didn't know that she could be a leader beforehand. And so I think the fact that she found herself in charge meant that she had to now deal with how do I lead these women? How do I set the standards? How do I do all the things I need to do? And so I think that's an interesting thing in that because they had to do it.
Baker and her unit made the crossing to Europe on the Celtic. Just 3 weeks later, the Celtic was torpedoed. The first unit arrived in Paris on March 24, 1918. They had to connect and disconnect calls while translating, remembering secret code words, and listening for the sounds of German spying. The American operators were an immediate success, and they earned the respect of the French operators. On March 30, 1918, the Baltimore Sun reported that the French colleagues of these American girls are surprised with the rapidity with which they take down the connections, the Americans frequently putting up one connection with the thumb and the forefinger, and at the same time taking down another with the little finger of the same hand. The operators were sent to switchboards in Paris, Chaumont, approximately 75 other French cities and towns, as well as London, Southampton, and Winchester in Britain. But battlefield victories in June and July of 1918 meant headquarters would have to move close to Saint-Mihiel. On August 25, 1918, a group of 6 bilingual telephone operators, led by Baker, arrived at the front. Men had operated the switchboards at night, but now the switchboards had to be under the control of the best operators at all times. There were days when operators had as little as 2 hours of sleep, and there were no days off. Cold and exhausted, the women's bodies began to break down, and the women fought illness and infections. Baker recalled sitting at the switchboard, shivering with chills, sweating with a fever, and with an aching stomach. One operator came down with the Spanish flu. Baker and her team were moved again, and they were given both the operating boards for the first time and the fighting lines. The army finally stopped pretending. Only the women worked the switchboard. The operators needed their steel helmets and gas masks, and they practiced using their pistols. Their sleeping and dining quarters burned down, and they ate their meals with the men. And then, on November 11, 1918, the fighting stopped. The war was over, but the army was not done with their operators. Baker was sent to oversee the telephone operations at the Allied Peace Conference. After months at the front, Baker found her assignment boring. She transferred to the Army of Occupation at Koblenz on the Rhine River in defeated Germany. Baker wasn't sent home until September of 1919. By the end of the war, 30 operators received special accommodations, with Baker receiving the Distinguished Service Medal. Exceptional women and an exceptional job had delivered exceptional service. The operators still serving were among the last to learn that the Army would not be honoring its promises to them. Having served longer than most because of their first in last out role, the women were entitled to more bonus money than the average doughboy, but they received nothing. The women had the support of the men who had known them best. Chief Signal Officer Russell had called them indispensable, but at home the Army would not help them. As the Signal Corps women battled the Army, rights for American women were taking a big step forward. It was clear that women had done their part. The Great War had changed President Wilson's mind concerning voting rights for women. He asked members of Congress, "Are we alone to ask and take the utmost women can give, service and sacrifice of every kind, and still say that we do not see what title that gives them?" The amendment to the Constitution did finally pass on June 4th, 1919. Decades later, champions for equal rights for African Americans were using the courts to sue their way to justice. Signal Corps operator Merle Egan Anderson wondered if the same strategy would work for the operators. She had help from the National Organization for Women and from Seattle attorney Mark Q. They also finally had a legal case that they could use. In 1972, the Russian Railway Service Corps won their case against the Army. These American male engineers wore uniforms with insignia and believed they were enlisted men. The courts found that wearing military uniforms was prohibited by the law, except for military personnel, so the men must have been in the Army. In May of 1977, Mark Q told the Senate Committee of Veterans Affairs that if the operators sued, they would win. President Jimmy Carter signed the GI Bill Improvement Act of 1977 into law. The telephone operators would receive their due. Merle Anderson, one of the few operators still alive to savor the triumph, said, "I deserve this medal not just for serving in France, but for fighting the U.S. Army for 60 years and winning." History will remember the Signal Corps female telephone operator unit as the first women's combat unit to serve in the United States Army.